Okay. I think we are on. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Quingane Waloma. It's good to be here tonight on April the 18th, 2021. Nina Shinzi KK Mark Peters and Ninun GAI and Alahi. The Munsee-Delaware Nation, up the river from Nahi, Alona Pawe Lakawit. And we're here for session number 42 of the Munsee-Delaware Nation history. And I was going to be jumping ahead tonight from the period that we've been at for some time now in the 1750s. We're going to jump ahead to the 1820s tonight, and we're going to look at Munsee land issues that followed us after we moved to the Thames River, or the Askunasippi as it's also known, or the Dishkanzibi, in around 1783 after the American Revolution. And just going to go to a map here. This is a map of the Thames River. This is the first survey of the Thames River. Began in 1790, and it was supposed to begin at what was called the Delaware Village. The large map is not so easy to read, but if you go to the right, you'll see the location of three separate Delaware villages, Munsee-Delaware villages. And as we've been discussing previously, a number of our people came through the Susquehanna, Allegheny, Cattaraugus, through Niagara Falls, and then through the Grand River and to here on the Thames River in Upper Canada. It was actually known as Quebec at the time until 1790, but I don't want to say that because it might be too confusing. But we, like I say, came that way, and also we came through Sandusky, Ohio, the Sandusky River area, and the Maumee River in Ohio. And we'll be looking at some of the people's names who moved here and where they moved from later on tonight. So none of what we're going to discuss tonight can be found in any book anywhere. It's based on research that we've been able to put together, and I'd like to refer to some of the people that helped in this. One of them was a woman named Susan Peters, and I'm not sure if she was Munsee, but I do have a record of her from back in the 1970s, a little bit before my time getting involved in this. And she, through the Public Archives of Canada, was able to locate a number of petitions, some of which we're going to look at tonight, from the Munsees to government officials beginning in 1826 and ending in 1909, and there's 23 of them in total that we won't go through all of them tonight, but we will refer to 3 or 4 examples. I was able to follow up on these petitions and what was said in them by the Munsee people who gave made oral statements about things that we did in the past that were written down in these petitions. And we're going to talk a bit about that. And as well, Laurie Leclerc research was quite helpful in putting together a good part of this as well. Going to get into the 1790s down the road a bit more, although we are going to discuss it tonight as well. And a woman by the name of Urvi Maheshwari was quite helpful in dealing with that time period and finding information that we're going to use at a later time. So, just want to check here. Make sure we're on, which I can't see if we are. But I'm really hoping we are. And don't see any messages to the contrary or even saying otherwise yet. But anyway, we're going to follow at a later time the period that we left off with last time in the 1760 period. We're going to go through Pontiac's War, the American Revolution, what's known as the Indian Wars, and the War of 1812 a little bit more thoroughly, and events that happen in between those, and continue on with life in our villages and other aspects of culture and tradition. However, I want to just focus on this period tonight. So like I say, we moved to this area around 1783 onto the Thames River, and had been living here and settled here for quite some time. There's maps we're going to see a bit later that show cornfields in these areas where the three Munsee-Delaware locations are. So we had extensive farming going on, and we're even able to supply troops and other First Nation villages with surplus corn that we were able to grow and have available by the 1790s. Now, I'm going to just go to this area here. We're going to start with what's called the surrender of the Longwoods Tract. Not by the Munceys. It was Chippewa land, and arrangements were made to surrender that land. And you'll see treaty number 25 here, and that's the area we're talking about. I just want to say that, there's much conflict that has arisen over the years and continues to today in some ways because of the circumstances surrounding this surrender. But I hope to show that it's mainly at the hands of shady officials, crooked surveyors, and land speculators, and the greed for land that has followed us, the Munceys, all the way from our homelands in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Trying to find some honest people, I guess, that would finally live up to the agreements that we had made. That wasn't to be. So I'm going to start with that. And in 1818, John Askin, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, began discussions with the various Chippewa villages in this area and outside of this area as well, and to arrange for this surrender. Yeah, okay, and then sorry here. I'm going to start with a letter from a guy named Ira Schofield to Daniel Springer in January the 20th, 1819. After this, John Askin had begun to discuss with the Chippewas the sale of this land. And he talks about a conversation he had with a Mr. Gideon Tiffany, who told him that he had lately returned from the Munsee village and he had a correspondence with the Indian chief of that place, and sufficient influence to prevent his carrying into execution the government purchase of the Indian lands. So he talked to this Munsee chief, and now he's questioning whether there's something here that they should consider before the surrender is made. And so that's just the beginning. But in March 9th, 1818, a provisional agreement is reached for the sale of this land and a provisional surrender of it. And in July 1819, a man named Colonel Claus, who we're going to discuss a bit, and related way back to, he has relatives going back into the American Revolution, and it was related to the family of Sir William Johnson and his children. But he provides a rough sketch of the south side of the Thames River, showing that the reserve should include land on that side as well. And on May 24th, 1820, three men from the Munsee-Delaware Nation decide to visit George Ironsides. And this is one day after this provisional agreement is signed. They didn't waste any time to express their concerns. And he says that these men called on him the day after the provisional agreement was signed and expressed surprise that with Tomico, Chief Tomico, who was a principal chief of the Chippewa Nation, they were not called upon to attend the council relating to this provisional surrender. And Tomico is, like I say, from my understanding, he's one of the chiefs of the Chippewas who lived in this area on the Thames at the time. And he says, I told them the lands had been ceded, and the chiefs had made certain reserves for their own people, on which the whites could have no claim, and I desired them not to interfere with the surveyors. He says, the Munseys on that river have no property to the soil. They sat down some years ago with permission from the Chippewas and were considered tenants at will. So this Ironside guy is one of the officials that I'm beginning to think is rather not quite honest in all of this. And this letter from Ironsides to William Claus is noted in a letter from 1891 from the Deputy Minister Stewart at the time, where he notes the old records, after examining them, I see the Munseys have a greater than occupancy interest. And he's replying to a request from a man named Scobie Logan in 1891, who we're going to learn more about down the road. He went to England and pursued our claim to the Queen there and took a tomahawk there with them, which we'll see pictures of at a later date. But this is kind of the beginning of what's going on here. And on November 25th, 1820, Captain Clips of the Munseys complains about surveyors taking over our lands. And as you can see on this map on the right, there's a, maybe it's not so easy to see. On the right, on the south side of the river, or the east side of the river as it is here, you'll see a number of Delaware homes. And I'm quite sure he's referring to these homes, which were, this land was being surveyed around this time. And Captain Clips, again, I'm not sure if that's exactly the right name, but it's how it's spelled from what I see. And he says, he's complaining about the surveyors surveying this land that we'd been on for a good 40 years already. But also an interesting thing he also says, he says the Munceys follow Aboriginal justice rather than white man's justice, which still exists in Muncey. And he complains about the surveyors cutting up their lands and forcing them off these lands and having to move. And then on July 27th, 1821, another letter from William Claus to a Major Hollins. Now, William Claus, again, with his historical connections to previous times, the War of 1812, the Indian Wars, and the American Revolution, has a little bit a better understanding of our situation than some of these other colonial officials who are somewhat new to the job. But he writes to Major Hollins, like I say, on July 27th, 1821. And he says that he wrote to Mr. Ironside on March the 20th of 1820. So this is right after, this is actually before the Munceys visited Ironsides, and he said we had no rights to the land. So this is going to be important in a little bit. So he writes to Ironside that reserves unquestionably will be admitted. That is, all reserves for the Indians themselves, and as such from the Chippewas to the late W. Askin. It appears they made the reserves for the sole purpose of planting corn and hunting, and therefore became actual settlers. The reserve at the southwest angle of Delaware Township I believe to be for the Munceys as well as for the Chippewas, as they are settled in that quarter, from the original sketch of that tract. So this Ironside guy is, like I say, after he gets this letter from Claus, later says, oh, I don't know anything about this, but he'd already received this letter telling him about it. So we're going to see he becomes a bit of a shady person in all of this. You gotta excuse me a bit here. And then again, on May the 3rd, 1822, Major Hillier of the Crown wrote to another Captain Hall, or rather Mr. Hollins, the Surveyor General. And he says, in the original agreement with the Chippewa Indians for the purchase of the Longwood Tract, it was their desire that certain reservations should be made for the benefit of persons who would, with their consent, settled on lands within that tract. And he's talking about the Munceys here. So there's discussion about our concerns leading up to the provisional agreements and after these provisional or temporary agreements, I guess you might call them. about our interests in this land and the agreement of at least the local Chippewas to that. But then on July 8th, 1822, a confirmatory agreement is signed for the sale of the Longwoods tract, and without our involvement in it. And on July 18th, 1822, Ironsides writes to Claus that the Munceys held a meeting at their lower Munsee council house stating the serious inconvenience and loss which will occur to their homes if the surveyors are allowed to run their lines as planned. Ironside posits that it was probably not the intention of the government that these people should be disturbed in their possession. So it sounds like he's kind of coming around a little bit at this point in time. And then on March 17th, 1823, John Matthews, Captain John Matthews, who we're going to talk a little bit more about, writes a letter to Major Hillier, who we just spoke about, asking for compensation for war losses for a relative of George Turkey by the name of Thomas Turkeyhive. And George Turkey is one of the men who lived in this area on the east side of the Thames River in one of those 5 homes you see there. And there's a creek that runs through there called Turkey Creek, and is still known as Turkey Creek today in Oneida. And that's where the name of that creek comes from, George Turkey. So on June 11th, 1823, there's a petition from the Munceys taken at the lower Munsee Village and recorded by Ironside, stating the serious inconvenience and loss which will occur to their homes if the surveyors are allowed to run their lines as planned. Again, that's kind of getting ready to survey what's known as Delaware Township, and by doing this they are disregarding our occupation in that area, and we are expressing our concern about that. But this is the first notice of a petition in this process that we're going to be talking about. Gonna double check here. It looks like we're on. Okay, I want to make sure. So anyway, I gotta keep going to these scenes here. On July 19th, 1823, this Captain Matthews writes to Sir Maitland, who's, I believe, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada at that particular time. And he writes a lengthy letter informing Maitland that a deputation of Munceys had come to visit him along with their interpreter to press their claims as loyal warriors to the king. And we talked about this before. And he tells Matthews their history of fighting alongside the British in both the French Indian War and the American Revolution. And we're going to see how the Munceys talk about this in the petitions we're going to look at in a little bit, and our involvement and allying with the British during this war throwing the French on their backs and scaling the walls of Quebec. And we talked about this, how the soldiers had to climb up this big cliff to get to the Plains of Abraham. And that's what scaling the walls of Quebec means, that we're going to see in these petitions that we have recorded. And that when we came to settle on the Thames, we were welcomed by the Chippewas who resided here on the Thames at that time as well. And if we go to this map, again, you'll see the Delaware villages, but right at the top of that big bend in the top of the river, you'll see a Chippewa village, and that's located in an area known as the Beaver property, I believe, today. He says, we were also promised by Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, following his visit to our villages, for a reserve 6 miles above and 6 miles below and 6 miles back on the east side of the river where they lived. So the significant amount of area that Lieutenant Governor promised to us. And if you take a look at this map, you'll see is a map of Governor Simcoe's journey from Niagara Falls to Detroit. And he did stop at the Munsee Castle, as he called it, at that time. And we're going to talk a bit more about those particulars in a couple minutes. And he also says that we visited Colonel Mckee in Detroit at a later time, who gave us a deed for these lands, which perished in a fire at the house of Chief Quakow. And Matthews endorses our character and our credibility at this time. Again, very similar to what we've been talking about as well, and being honest people who really didn't know the concept of lying. And based on what we've talked about over the past 40 sessions, I think it's become clear the integrity and honor that we had in our dealings. So, get lost here. We're at, I gotta mark this off with a pen as we go along. So, whoops, not quite done here. So anyway, that's the letter from Matthews to Maitland in 1823. And then in September the 2nd, 1823, Hillier, the civil secretary, as he's called here, writes to Captain Matthews, informing him that the claims of the Munceys have already engaged the consideration of the government, and that its decision thereon was sometime since communicated to the head of the proper department in order to its being conveyed to the Indians, to the Munceys. And then on September 20th, these things are all happening in short periods of time. There's no what they call latches here. We're doing this right after things happen and continue almost yearly until the 1900s, in a sense, to continue expressing our concerns about how we're being treated. So on September 20th, 1823, again, Matthews writes to Major Hillier that he's communicated Hillier's letter to the Munceys, and the Munceys state they've received no communication on this subject yet. So we write him a letter on the 2nd of September, and on the 20th of September, we're saying, well, where's your response? Very interesting, really. And then on October the 30th, 1823, Hillier writes back to Matthews that the letter was submitted to the Lieutenant Governor, Maitland, I suppose, regarding the Munseys. And His Excellency is at all times ready to give due attention to any representation which the Indians may find it necessary to make on matters within the cognizance of the provincial government. But they must make them through the proper channels, namely the Indian Department. So we're kind of going to the top as we have in past periods of time. But now we're being told, well, you got to go through the Indian Department. And then on November 10th, Captain Matthews writes to Major Hillier and says the Munsee inquire as to who they should properly be addressing for their claim. Again, this claim has gone on a long time. And he says the Munsees promised to return to Captain Matthews in 2 weeks to hear Hillier's answer. So we're giving him 2 weeks to respond. And November the 26th, 1823, Matthews makes a list of the losses we sustained during the War of 1812 and notes the losses of property, farms, and other items sustained during that war. And we're going to talk a bit more about that tonight as well and at a later period. And then on November 26th, November 27th, 1823, Captain Matthews again writes to Major Hillier. We visited Matthews and gave him a list of the community members that had suffered losses during that war. And Matthews attests to our honesty and explains that we have lost so much because we were steady farmers from the actions of the Americans, I imagine, during that war. So then on December the 5th, 1823, another letter from Captain Matthews to Major Hillier. And Matthews acknowledges Hillier's letter of the 27th regarding stating the correct person to contact would be the Indian Superintendent at Amherstburg, and reminds the Civil Secretary that the statement of the Indian Munsee chiefs, which I conveyed to you under the date of 19th of July last, you will therein find that they complain that they have not participated in His Majesty's annual bounty of presents, and which have been refused to them, that their lands have also been surveyed, and that they fear they shall be driven from them, and appeal directly to His Excellency the Lieutenant Governor as the representative of the great King and Father. So we're kind of bypassing his recommendation to go to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, probably because we don't trust him. And we go again right to the Lieutenant Governor. And then on March the 17th, 1824, Captain Matthews writes to Major Hillier again. And he relates that the Munsee Chief George Turkey is seeking reparations for a relative, Thomas Turkey Hive. And he also says he has no faith in the abilities of the Indian superintendent, and that this attitude is shared by all the natives in the vicinity, and that Matthews believes they may resort to relocating to the United States because of the injurious treatment by the department, the Indian Affairs Department back then. And that becomes a continuing story as well. But like I say, we were referred to communicate through the Indian superintendent, but then we said, no, nobody likes this guy. We're going to go right to the lieutenant governor, who's the representative of the king, and the way we've always dealt with these matters in the past. So then on April 10th, 1825, another letter from Captain Matthews to, this time, John Johnson, who I believe is the superintendent of Indian Affairs during this time period, and asked Johnson why the Munceys, who have occupied their lands for generations, should be driven off their lands. If so, they will be forced to accept the governor of Michigan's invitation and move there. And then in August 13th of 1825, another letter from George Ironside, who we've been talking about, seems to be a bit shady here. He writes a letter to Captain Matthews after Matthews' letter to him on August 5th, and he says he is aware that the Chippewas who signed the Longwoods Treaty have requested a surveyor to lay out their lands, but does not know if this has been carried out. And he adds, as for a Munsey Town Indian Reserve, I never heard of it, all reserves having been made by the Chippewas who sold the land and were the proprietors of the soil. But as we talked about, he was informed about this by William Claus even before the final agreement in 1822. He was informed about it in 1819. And even other letters following that, he would have been well made aware that there was something more to this, but he totally denies it here. Even though, like I say, there are many letters sent to him telling them that there was this interest. So on September the 1st, 1825, Captain Matthews again writes to the Lieutenant Governor Maitland. And this Captain Matthews, again, I've said before, there are certain British officers, Crown representatives, who were decent people and had honor, had real honor, especially some of these military men, because we'd fought beside them and developed very close relationships. And some of them were willing to side with us to make sure these honorable agreements were upheld, and Captain Matthews is one of them. So on September the 1st of 1825, he writes to Lieutenant Governor Maitland that the Munsey chiefs have visited Matthews and in great alarm, as the Chippewas have sold the whole of their lands without allotting for a Munsey reserve. Although Major Hillier, had stated that the Munsey case has already engaged the consideration of the government and that its decision thereon was sometime since communicated to the head of the proper department in order to its being conveyed to the Indians. So again, they're saying our claim, our issues have been taken to the top and are being considered. And he restates, and this is 1825, he restates the Munsee-Delaware loyalties to the Crown, promises made by Simcoe, a deed given by Mckee, and drafted by Purdue Selby, which perished in a fire in the house of chief named Quakow or Capcow here. It's the spelling is hard to read in the original documents. And again, Matthews endorses the character of the Munsey people and the sacrifices they have made to remain loyal to the king. And this Purdue Selby is a name that kind of slipped by me over past years as we've been researching for this actual deed that was given by Simcoe or possibly Mckee or even both. Now that I have that name noted, I'm going to look further into his records that might be available about things he wrote, and apparently he drafted this deed on behalf of Mckee. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along as well. So that's September 1st. And in 1825, I didn't have a record of 1825. This man on the lower left, his name is Peter Jones, a Kakewakwanabe, a Mississauga First Nations person. He notes that the Munceys at Munsey Town are wanting to keep their traditional ways. And again, this is similar to what was said about native justice and other things, ways of life that we had wanted to continue on with that were even back in the 1750s a significant issue that was dealt with by these Munsee-Onawotuk, or prophets even as they're called in some texts. But Peter Jones becomes important as we get into the 1820s and 30s and 40s. We're not going to talk much about him tonight, but when we get to that period again down the road, we will talk about him a little bit further. And on February the 2nd, 1826, the chief Atomico, as he's spelt in at this point in time, or Tomico, the road I live on, just right outside my door here, is called Tomago Road, and is named after this chief. And he was, like I say, a principal chief of the Chippewas, but his son, John Tomico, married a Munsey woman. And because of our maternal, I don't know if the proper word, but the maternal aspect of our ways at that time, and the Chippewas as well, John Tomago, the son of the chief who married a Munsey woman, became a Munsey person. The man married into the woman's family, not the other way around as it is in European ways at that time, and would eventually become part of the way we do things today as well. But he actually writes to Ironside, this questionable guy, and he says he wants to know what you mean. By and by, next summer, we will talk about the piece of land that was left to us, or the reserve to their tribe. He says he will come to see you, and he will be informed that the errand is in vain. And when he does come, he will bring powder. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it doesn't sound good. He says, Mukwamis has no authority to act for his tribe, and that Bear Creek Chippewas speak the same as he, Tomigo, does. He says the chiefs will tell Ironside the same thing when they told him when they sold the land. So there's a little bit of a fire going on here to Chief Tomigo and this other man named Mukwamis. Mukwamis or Mukwaminus. Two ways to spell that as well. And then on February the 3rd, Clench, J.B. Clench, who people were familiar with around here as a swindler as well in certain ways, but he's a questionable guy. He seems to be good in some ways and then not so good in other ways. He's kind of in the middle here. But, and Ironsides is kind of a little bit further on the not so good side. But Clench does some bad things. And he says, Clench says Tomigo is the chief of the Chippewas of the Thames and Bear Creek. And he sends a Tomigo's letter that it may be judged as George Turkey commented on it. But George Turkey's comments are not included with this letter. And he says he will send this meaning of Atomico in another letter, which sounds kind of shady the way that's worded as well. And there's an enclosure with this letter that says, it appears Mukwamis is the one who raised the alarm and instigated the Munsees to memorial the commander-in-chief through Captain Matthews. And then on February 4th, 1826, Tomigo writes to Ironsides again, many stories have been in circulation about the land where he now resides, and he is desirous to know the truth of the matter. He warns against Captain John Chief, that's another name for Mukwamis, and that he has no authority to act for this tribe, the Chippewas here on the Thames. And I'm not sure where Mukwamis or John Chief is actually from. Like I said, there's a bit of a fire developing from things that are going on about through this surrender and our part in it, and Chief Tomigo, and saying the Bear Creeks think similar to him, is supporting our position that we should have been included in some way, either in this surrender or had our rights recognized through the agreement we had with the British when we moved here after the American Revolution that was upheld by Simcoe and then Mckee, and then further upheld by us during the War of 1812 and General Brock, as we're going to talk a little bit about. But on May 8th, 1830, this petition is, we've got June 25th, or rather wrong one, sorry. May 26th, 1830. No, May 8th, 1826. Let me find that. I had the wrong one. Oh, here we go. May 8th, 1830. This, May 8th, 1826. This petition was written by Captain Matthews, and it was written based on oral tradition, oral history that we told him on that date in May of 1826. And the signatories to this letter were men who were alive when some of these things they're referring to happened. And so it's not really oral tradition or history in some parts of it. It's actually eyewitness events. But at this, through this petition, it's a petition from the Munceys to the Governor General this time, not just the Lieutenant Governor, but the Governor General of Canada, it looks like, or British North America might have been called still in those times. But it states that the Munceys held vast land in America, but were forced to leave it because of the English. The Munceys applied to the Chippewas for assistance, and the Chippewas acknowledged their descent from the Delaware and as grandfather. And there's an oral history of the Chippewas coming from the east, and might be a relative to that. So, and permitted them to settle on any of their lands. The Munceys are concerned that some of their farms have been surveyed and will be given to the white people. And again, we're talking about the lands on the east side of the river at Turkey Creek, where these families I mentioned were living, and it was being surveyed over by this guy named Marlon Burwell. It's kind of a shady surveyor. He said the land was given to them, and they have had it undisturbed possession of it for a good 40 years by the time this, well, even 45 years by the time this petition is made, and have made it valuable. So we didn't just come and plop down there. We, like I say, we developed large, extensive cornfields and other crops that we had been growing for the past few hundred, even 1,000 years or more. And it says, when Simcoe came through Muncey, which he did, as I mentioned, in 1793, he heard the history of the Munceys and promised them that when the property was bought from the Chippewas, he would make the Munceys a deed. The deed was given, and this is probably regarding the south side of the Thames, which was purchased in 1790, and given to Captain Quakow, but his house burned and the deed with it. And the signatories to this petition, and there's more to it to read. It's incredible, again, oratory that the Munceys continue on from oratory that we spoke about the last time and other speaking skills. The signatories to this included George Turkey, Cornelius Westbrook, John Logan, Thomas Snake, and William Half Moon. And so, like I say, we, I might, this is the point where I was going to get into it. I'm going to get into a bit further about Simcoe. I thought I was, maybe I'll do it now. But Simcoe, as I mentioned, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe came through this area in 1793 on his way from Niagara Falls to Detroit, and he had 8 officers with him, and also with him were Joseph Brant, or Tyondenaga, the Mohawk chief, and 7 warriors. And they came through Munsey in February of 1793. And like I say, the things these guys are saying are true. You know, when I first read these things, it was like, how do you prove that? But after reading Mrs. Simcoe's book and the journals of this guy named Major Littlehales, it became quite clear that, yes, Simcoe did come through here in 1793. He stayed overnight. We had eggs and maybe even bacon in the morning. They also had a council on that night with Joseph Brant and Lieutenant Governor Simcoe and the Munseys, and it's not clear exactly what happened. There's actually no record that we can find of it, other than what our own people are saying some 35 years later about what happened. And some of these guys, like I say, were probably at least alive then, if not young adults. They might not have been at the meeting, but they surely would have heard about it from the chiefs and other men who were at the meeting with Simcoe. So Simcoe, like I say, was on his way to Detroit to discuss making peace between the First Nations and the Americans, who we had been fighting for some 10 years now during what's called the Indian Wars, which came on after the American Revolution to make sure the lands west of the Ohio River remained Indian lands according to what's known as the Royal Proclamation that was made in 1763, and that we were partly responsible for making sure occurred. So it's very interesting, anyway, to me. Scene 34, okay, there's the map of Simcoe. So on May 10th, 1826, Captain Matthews writes to Sir John Johnson this time, who's direct descendant of William Johnson again, but doesn't appear to be have quite the same memory of our alliance with the British Crown as some of these other officers. And Matthews, in his letter, rebuts the statement that Ironside made about never hearing about a Munsey reserve. So, as I mentioned, this Ironside guy is saying this, but there's lots of documentation to show he knew about it. And Matthews says the same thing. And he says, I, however, my lord, have heard of it. Years after, when permitted by His Excellency, the Lieutenant Governor, to make a journey of examination into this part of the country, for the purpose of selection of that reserve, it was particularly pointed out to me in the Surveyor General's office. The question now, my lord, is very simple. Shall these Indians, 200 in number, be driven to starve with their families in the wilderness, or their only alternative, shall they accept an invitation that I have no doubt has been conveyed to them from the government of Michigan to settle there, as we mentioned earlier? Matthews begs Johnson's political view on this expediency of not driving the Munseys away. And he sends along the petition that we just referred to. And then on June 29th, 1826, the Civil Secretary George Hillier writes to the Military Secretary General Darling a lengthy letter outlining the Munsey's case, our case, and Matthews' efforts to support us in it. And then on August the 2nd, 1826, Ironside writes to Claus that he forgot to give the papers over until this moment of writing, and he believes Mugwamis, as I mentioned before, raised this alarm. And he states that at the signing of the annual Longwoods Treaty, the 6th annual Longwoods Treaty present, so this is 6 years after this treaty, it's an annual thing, Tomago, in the presence of officers at the garrison, positively affirmed that the Chippewas did not set any land aside for the Munceys. So again, this is just an outright lie, really. And he says Tomago positively affirmed, which doesn't sound like, that's kind of suspicious in itself. But again, we referred to Tomago's own words that he was in support of us having lands in this area. But now he's saying, Ironside is saying a couple of years later, that's not the case either. Sorry. August 2nd. Anyway, on August the 30th, 1826, Claus writes to Lieutenant Colonel Napier and dismisses the and believing Ironside and what Tomago told Ironside, he dismisses the claims of the Munceys. So, he's listening to lies told to him by Ironside and saying, well, if that's true, then the Munceys have no claim. But he adds, as those people have been in possession, to my knowledge, upwards of 30 years, and it had actually been a good 40 or 50 years by 1826, I should think it good policy that they be allowed to occupy the ground yet unlocated, which is not clear what he means by that, which they have been accustomed to plant. Indians are strongly wedded to the places they have long occupied, and particularly where they have buried their dead. So he's saying, even though Ironsides is saying this, there's still something more to it. And on September 26th, 1826, Johnson writes to his Major Darling that there is no basis for this claim, again, based on this false information that started with Ironside. But he concurs with Claus that the Munceys should be able to occupy the ground remaining unappropriated by government. And again, it's just not quite clear what is meant by that, but it's interesting. And it needs to be further looked into what is meant by these words, unappropriated by government and unlocated. And then an interesting thing comes up in 1827, which is a book by a guy named Captain Hendrik Appomet. And he's a Mohican who we'd had relationships going way back into the 1760s and 70s. But he comes through Muncey in 1791 on his way to Detroit to do the same thing Simcoe is doing with us in that area, the Western Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg Nation peoples. But Hendrik Appomet is basically bringing a message from the American government and making it clear that the Americans are the ones we should be talking to and making peace with, rather than listening to the British, who would later somewhat abandon us when it came to the end of this Indian Wars at the Battle of Fallen Timbers that we're going to get to. And I think I got a picture of Hendrik Oppomet somewhere. I do. Just don't have the right scene written down. Darn. Oh, here he is. Here's Captain Hendrik Oppomet, the Mohican who I've been talking about. And we, as I've mentioned in previous sessions, have had a very close relationship with the Mohicans forever, even going back to, the first days of our memories in the thousands of years ago on the Hudson River. So there's this close relationship, and he comes through here, and I have his writings, his journal, are about this trip he made, similar to Simcoe's, to Detroit, and what happened there. And I'm going to be discussing that at a later time. But this is him, a drawing of him from that period, I suppose, and a plaque which talks about him as well. He's a member of the Stockbridge Indian tribe, where we've talked about, translated Catechism and Bible into the Indian language, was in the Revolutionary War with Colonel Patterson's regiment in 1775 and was a Revolutionary War hero. And was presented with a captain's sword by George Washington, buried in Kaukauna in 1830. So he's quite the person, this Captain Hendrik. And we'll be learning more about him down the road. It's going to be 10 after 8, but I'm just going to get through this tonight. So, in April of 1828, Peter Jones, who we talked about, notes that Tomico's camp or village is 10 kilometers downriver from Munsey town, which we see on the map on the right. These three Delaware villages are basically Munsey town, and downstream from there 10 kilometers is Tomico's village, which leaves the question as to who these Chippewas are up in this bend and what's now known as the Beaver property. And I kind of wonder if this village could be related to the chief known as Sakehos, who was involved in Pontiac's revolution, and who I'm really beginning to think we got to know during that time because of our involvement in that particular situation and our closeness by that time to this area on the Thames. And that it might have been through Sakehos and his invitation that we came to reside here on the Thames. And there's going to be references we'll look at later on that was found by one of our researchers, indicating that we were clearly invited by the Western Confederacy to come and settle on these lands. So, just pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, on June 28th, 1828, or June 25th, 1828, another petition is sent to government officials. Keep getting lost here. Anyway, this is, oh, that's not it. This is it, I think. Oh, yeah, this is it right here. June 25th, 1828. this petition is sent to His Excellency the Right Honorable James Earl of Elgin and Kincardine and the Governor General of British North America. Like I say, we went right to the top. And at that, through this petition that I'm mentioning here, is a council of Westbrook, Captain Turkey, and Snake, where they say, as much as 40 years ago, the Munsey chiefs procured from Colonel Mckee a deed giving them 12 by 6 miles of land on the south side of the Thames. So, Mckee, we haven't really talked about much yet, but he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs at Detroit during the 1790s. He had a long history and relationship with the Munceys going back to the 1750s in the Susquehanna area that we've talked about. His father was a trader, not a traitor, a trader at that time, and Alexander Mckee kind of followed him in his footsteps, but became what's known as one of these frontier diplomats over the years, and he was married to a Shawnee woman who, again, were very close relatives to us also. And we did, as is said here, these men are saying in 1828, he gave us this deed, and, been able to find out since then that in 1790, Mckee refers to this ancient people who'd come to this area and asking for permission to assist us in land. And then in 1795, there's a record of us passing through Moravian Town, and the Moravian missionary there writes a note that we'd come through there with the Chippewas on our way down to see Mckee. And then they write another note that on our way back, we'd come back, we were quite happy, had lots of presents, and something good appears to have happened. But in between that, there's a letter from Mckee. I'm not sure who it's to, but he talks about the speech of the Munceys to him during that visit, and he wrote a speech back to us. We've got the letter that he wrote, but we don't have copies of the speech we made to him or his answers to our speech, which must include what these men are talking about here in 1828. And then there's a little bit of confusion here regarding whether it was Simcoe who gave this deed to Captain Quakow, the chief, or whether it was Mckee. But they say that Mckee said the land on the north side. So this deed from Mckee was for land on the south side. Like I say, we'd been farming and living even on the south side of the Thames since 1783, 40 years by this time, but probably 15 years at the time we went to visit Mckee. And so he promised us these lands on the south side of the Thames, according to this statement here, of 12 by 6 miles. And then Mckee said that the land on the north side would eventually be purchased from the Chippewas, and the Munceys would then be given a tract of land on that side as well. So, as we've seen here, the right side of this river here is basically the south side, and shows we had homes there, and there's another map, which we're going to see maybe in a minute, that shows we had extensive cornfields on both the south and the north side. But this shows we also had quite a few homes on the north side. And so it made sense for us to want to have guarantees of land on the south side and the north side, and which our people in 1828 said Mckee promised to us. And like I say, there's lots of evidence to show we went to visit him, and there's even other references to our promise of lands in this area. There's one of the Moravian missionaries in 1799 visited Detroit and was promised, I think it was by Peter Russell, I'm not sure, that the Munsee lands would be protected. So what these guys are saying here, there's some factual basis to it. And as I've said before, we have been through lots of land arrangements throughout the past hundreds and hundreds, 200 or 300 years already. And we were very honorable people and weren't prone to making things up or lying. And the historical traditions that were carried on were very much based on facts. And even these men that are saying these things here were quite likely even alive and present during this time period. And then he says Sir John Johnson said the same thing, although we see John Johnson later on not saying the same thing. And, that's there's more to it that you can read, but that's the basics of it. So that's that particular petition. And not quite done there. Scene 31. On April the 10th, 1830, this surveyor, Marlon Burwell, came through Munsey. He's the person who was surveying over those lands we were complaining about earlier letters, the lands on the south side of the Thames. He was surveying them into lots so that they could be sold to settlers and basically stealing our land. But in April 10th, 1830, Burwell comes to Munsey, and he does some things that are kind of useful. He does a census of our village, and he writes down all of the, well, not quite all, but most of the people who live here during that time. And you can see all the names there, and you can see who they were. Most of them are Munceys, but you see some Munsey Shawnee, and one of them is Captain Jem Snake, the nephew of Tecumseh, and also a Chippewa and a Cayuga. But like 96% of these, or 95% of these names are Munceys. And it also notes the locations that we had come from. Susquehanna, Cattaraugus. I'm not sure that other one, but there's one that says Minisink, and there's a few that say Minisink. So some of these people were born in the area of Minisink that we spoke about quite some time ago on the Delaware River. You got Fort Wayne. Excuse me, my voice is going away here. Grand River, and Cattaraugus, Sandusky, born here, Cattaraugus, born here, and there's others that were from the Maumee River as well that I can't see right now. And it talks about how much corn we had and where it was. And it shows we had extensive farming operations going on, really. And it says the size of the families, all kinds of interesting information. But he also did a map, and I couldn't get this map to go the right way, even I tried like 10 or, not 10, but 3 or 4 times anyway. So if you look sideways, you can see the similar area on the 1790 map we were talking about. And unfortunately, it's just not so clear, but you can see cornfields on both sides of the river in areas, and where all the Munsee villages are and towns. But if you look at the map, you don't see that area on Turkey Creek where George Turkey and a number of other families lived. All of a sudden, like they say, we got surveyed out of there. and the lands became available to settlers. And some of the families that are missing from that map and are missing from this census as well, they're not on the census. It's like some of these families didn't exist and were just written right out of the record. George Turkey was one of these families, Thomas Turkey Hive, John Killsnake, and Jim Pony. Some of these people actually, because their land was stolen again, moved with some of the Moravians who had similar issues in their area to White River, Indiana, and then either north up to Wisconsin or south down to Kansas and Oklahoma. And I don't know, I've got scene 34. Oh, okay. Scene 34 is this. I don't know if I mentioned it yet. I thought I was going to come in here, but the map of these two soldiers, one an Indian warrior and the other a British soldier, is reference to a man named Colonel John Butler, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, I believe, and who we say in one of these petitions, we fought with the man that wore the green coat. And that's all it says. And again, when I first read these, I thought, what the heck do they mean by that? But I later found out that Colonel John Butler, who was almost like, these guys were like the first special forces, how the special forces in the U.S. Army came to be developed, some of the things they did actually, and even before him, Rogers Rangers. But Colonel Butler and his men wore green coats. And we fought with him, and also Joseph Brant, Tandonega, and the Mohawks fought with him. And where we were living on the Susquehanna at the time, we joined forces with Joseph Brant and Colonel Butler in striking into those areas we struck previously during the French Indian War, and caused a lot of problems, which resulted in significant losses to us at a later date that we're going to get into down the road. But this petition I'm referring to here was written in 1830, and it's regarding attempt by the government to create what's called the Village of Coburn, where the Munceys and Chippewas would live together. And then he says, your forefathers, and he's talking to Sir John Coburn here, your forefathers were great warriors, and with the assistance of our forefathers threw the French on their backs. Again, this is referring to the French Indian War, which when I read this was like, what? But then realizing that, yeah, we did side with the British after the Treaty of Easton and fought against the French. And then later, your late father was a brave man. He wore a green coat. Again, this was the uniform of Butler's Rangers that we just mentioned. And he assisted us to strike the Virginians and Kentuckians in several battles. And under your direction, we shall ever be ready to defend our beloved king against all his enemies. So even though no local wars would continue after this until the Fenian raids in 1838, where the Munceys and Chippewas provided 50 men to guard the western entrance to the city of London that's just down the road from us, we definitely showed that we had been allies with the British during the French Indian Wars, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812, which we're going to get to in a minute as well. Boy, we're getting to 8:30, hour and a half. But anyway, it's just another interesting thing that occurs here. And then on January the 27th, 1841, after this 1830 item, the Delaware chiefs tell the superintendent about fighting with General Brock during the War of 1812, and that many chiefs and warriors fell during that period. And so it's like, yeah, sure, you fought with General Brock. Well, everybody might say that, but in fact, if you go to a book by this guy, well, not by him, but about him, if I can find it. Yeah, this guy on the left, it's not a very good picture, but it's called A Mohawk Memoir. It's just written recently by Carl Ben. A Mohawk memoir from the War of 1812 about John Norton, or Tyanan Hokarwan, who was a right-hand man, in a way, of Joseph Brant during this time period. And in this book, he talks quite a bit about the Munceys and Chippewas who fought under his command during the War of 1812. And on March the 1st, 1814, he's described as an Indian chief, and listed under his care are the Munceys of the Thames, together with Moravian Delawares, enumerated as 100 warriors. On the Munceys, he says, the latter joined Captain Norton when proceeding with the army under General Brock for the capture of Detroit. So what these guys are saying in 1830 about General Brock is, verified by what Norton is saying, who was a colonel at this point, and is just basically saying exactly what we said some 30 years later. And he says, have since shown their fidelity to the crown. It is the wish of the commander of the forces, therefore, that the opportunity be afforded to Captain Norton to protect and reward these people according to their merits. And October 30th, 1816, in a letter from Colonel John Norton to his man named Lieutenant Colonel Harvey, he talks about that specifically about the Munceys of the Thames, the Munsee village of the River Thames, which has been inhabited by these people upwards of 25 years, and a little bit more actually, and who with the neighboring Chippewas principally formed the party that followed me to join the late General Sir Isaac Brock at the capture of General Hull, and prior to which event enabled me to prevent the enemy's communication with the River Thames. So, again, like our part with Butler's Rangers and now with John Norton, these guys and us and the Chippewas are all doing things that later became sort of copied by what becomes known as special forces in the U.S. Army. And I know someone who's writing a book about that right now, and I can't wait till it's done to read it. But in remembrance of their fidelity on this and many subsequent occasions, like this was not a one-time thing, I hope that 12 miles along the banks of the River Thames, comprising the site of their village and cornfields, may be granted and secured to them and their posterity forever. And he also believes that not having these lands secured and defined to them has caused widespread degradation among the indigenous communities now living in Upper Canada. So, just as we said Simcoe and later Mckee had promised these lands to us. Captain, or rather Colonel John, Major John Norton at this time, he becomes a colonel. And he was actually the last person in Upper Canada to fight a duel. And he killed a guy through this duel. But he's quite a character. There's many more guys like him, even Munseys, as we've talked about, but just some really interesting characters. These guys didn't fool around. And had some pretty interesting incidents that occurred in their lives. And if you read this book about him, you'll find these things out. But anyway, we're almost done. So he just backs up this claim that we already had for this land on the Thames promised to us, and now our participation in the War of 1812 should suggest that we have even more right to it. And then on April 11th, 1846, the Munseys write a letter about the promises of King George III. And these wampum ballot is somewhat representative of that promise of King George III. These belts, I tried to get them to go the right, rotate them, and they rotated in where they're saved, but when I brought them into the software program, they weren't rotated, so you got to kind of turn your head a little bit. But the one in the middle is the same as the one on the left. The one on the left is being held by a guy named Jacob Dolson. Many people are related to this man that live here right now. But he gave it to a guy named Mark Harrington, who took it, and now didn't just take it. He was given to him with a letter saying that we had access to it at any time we want. And it now hangs in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And the one in the middle is that belt. It says, I always thought it said GT, and on the wording above it, it says it refers to a treaty between the Munseys and King George III. But on further research by one of our researchers, Laurie LeCara, as I mentioned, it's quite likely that this belt actually has the initials GI. And they come from a man named Guy Johnson, I think was the son of Sir William Johnson. And there's an actual date on which it was given to us in 1780. I don't have the actual date, but this is quite likely that one of those belts. See, there's the belt that we got from him at that time. And again, you don't just get belts or give them for nothing. It represents our alliance with the British Crown during the American Revolution, and some sort of promise, and we say it's the promise of land here in Upper Canada in exchange for our alliance during the Revolution. The one on the right is another belt that came from Moraviantown. I'm quite sure it came from Muncey before it went to Moraviantown. Shows two men holding hands. It's in friendship. And then there's ICS or IGS. I don't know if it refers to Governor Simcoe, but it could be related to his journey through here in 1793. There's more work that needs to be done on that. It's apparently held somewhere by the Canadian government at this time. So, got one final petition here from April the 3rd, 1753. Just going to do a little summary of that. And again, it's a petition from the Munseys. And again, it talks about Colonel Butler promising all the necessities of land in Canada in exchange for our alliance. And like I say, it's clear that we did fight with Colonel John Butler during the American Revolution. This belt that we just saw could very well be part of that promise. The Munceys came to this country under the conduct of Butler after leaving the Susquehanna, which again, we've talked about where we lived on the upper Susquehanna, and that people here were from the towns of Atsinasink and Chemung or Willawana, and more than likely related to this chief named Egahohoan, who was a signatory to the Treaty of Easton and also married to a woman named Queen Esther that we're going to talk about down the road also. And it says, a wampum belt was produced, which showed to the road to the seat of government that was open to the Munceys, and which had the houses of government and the Munceys on either end. So we don't know where this belt is. Mention is made how Generals Proctor and Brock renewed the promises in the War of 1812. And there also talk about the rebellion in 1837 and 1838, when the Munceys allied with the British again and with the Chippewas and sending 50 men to guard the western entrance to the city of London. And he says, now they have no lands except those owned by the Chippewas and receive only half annuities and none for their children. And so this is how we come to be dealt with after our incredibly long 60-year alliance with the British Crown. Now that we moved here and these officials and surveyors and land speculators start to do what they've done to us for the few hundred years before this. And because we had no support from the government after this period of time, we received nothing like other First Nations did from the surrenders of their land, annuities and other benefits. We had to farm and find our own way to survive without being able to receive what we were entitled to based on our alliance. And we continued to do that through the 1800s and even until today. But this petition in 1852 was signed by Isaac Dolson, who was a warrior in the War of 1812, and I understand he was something like 14 years old at the time. And he's directly related to the Jacob Dolson who held that wampum belt, and the past chief here named William Dolson in the 1750s. And like I say, many other Dolsons who continue to live here. It was also signed by William Half Moon and John Tomaco. Again, John Tomaco is the son of Chief Tomaco, who supported us back in the 1820s. This is 1852 now. And it's also signed by an Abraham Huff, which is a very common name here in Chippewa and in Moraviantown. So we're going to kind of end there, finally. Oh my God, it's a long night. But like I said, these petitions, I wish I could just read the whole thing, but we'd be here for hours. There was 23 of these petitions between 1826 and 1909, and it was clear that as soon as we realized we were being railroaded again by the government, we made our complaints and continued to make them monthly and yearly and consistently over the next 100 years. And even until today, we're still pursuing this claim to be treated as the allies we were, and for the government to live up to the promise it made to us based on that alliance for lands in Upper Canada, fighting during the American Revolution, even back in the French Indian War, and significantly in the War of 1812, when, as I said, we lost many chiefs and warriors. And as we'll see when we get to this period, we're going to go more over these things that happened, other than what we've talked about tonight. We suffered severe casualties during the War of 1812, as mentioned by Colonel John Norton. So, after all this, we just continued to be neglected and left aside by these new officials that come into the picture would have no understanding or honor, at least, regarding these past relationships, and then it would just simply be all forgotten until now. So anyway, that's it for tonight. 8:40, an hour and 40 minutes. Boy, I knew it was going to be long. I didn't know it was going to be this long, but I don't know if anybody's still with me. But anyway, I'm going to say the Pishkanawa Lomwa. We'll see everybody next time on next Sunday. And have a good evening. Anishik.